Well, guys, welcome back to a studio episode from the Ramblin podcast. It's been a hot minute since Brent and I were in the studio, but we're excited to be putting out another episode here today. We got quite a few things we plan to cover. We're going to go over some different gear. Brent and I are going to get into a pretty heated gear debate. I think we'll see how it goes, but we've got some ideas for you guys for both either if you're trying to ball on a budget with gear, or if you're trying to say this is the ideal situation, or you just happen to have a bunch of money that you want to throw at some gear. So we're going to go into some different ins and outs with that. But to start off here, Brent and I have wanted to just kind of update you a little bit on what we've been up to. We've been on 2 trips here recently together, and maybe wanted to just give a quick rundown on what we were doing there. But before we get going, remember, if you are watching this, you can actually listen to this on podcasts, wherever you get podcasts from. Or if you are listening, we will have this episode live on YouTube as well at the Ramblin podcast. Before we dive into everything, though, I think Brent has an announcement that he wants to make. What you got for us, Brent?
Let's just go for it. Those of you
that out of the way.
Yep. I think most of everyone knows that I have been the G. Loomis rep in the Southern Rockies. Along with that, I was also repping a bunch of hunting brands, and an opportunity came along in the fly fishing world, only in the fly fishing world, and I decided to take it. So I have since switched from G. Loomis to Farbank. So I made the switch over to Farbank, and I'm just really, really excited to be in the fly fishing space only. I think I'll have a lot more time to interact with all the shops around this area and continue just focusing in the fly fishing world.
I think a lot of people probably had no idea how much hunting stuff you were doing, especially here, on the Ramblin' Fly podcast. But you really only had one fly fishing company, really, if I'm not wrong, which is G. Loomis. The rest of what you did was all just general outdoor or hunting.
Right. Yeah. So I had G. Loomis and Fishyware, and then the bulk of what I had to do was on the hunting side. And I obviously love to hunt and like that a lot, but I would say more than that, I like to be in the fly world. So this was an opportunity for me to stay in the fly world and really focus on it, which is where I want to be. So really excited about that. Definitely going to miss some of the crew on the Loomis side, and hopefully we'll run into each other around. But yeah, a new chapter for me.
There we are. Well, congrats, Brent.
Thank you. Well, let's talk about the trips that we had recently taken.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about this vehicular trip?
Little vehicular trip. So we're gonna break something up a little bit here, and Blue Line is coming out with a new film. Hopefully, you guys really like that bass film we put out. We got a lot of awesome views and a lot of great comments, and people have been reaching out to me saying that they really loved the bass video. So that kind of put a little bit extra wind in our sails, I feel like, to keep kind of rolling. Brent and I decided there's a video that I've been wanting to do for quite a while. I like cars and trucks, and I've had quite a few vintage 4-wheel drive things myself. Well, I bought another one, and we're kind of turning it into like a budget overlanding rig. And we just did a film with that with me, Brent. We brought Hobo Steve along and our buddy Colby, who helped us do a bunch of support.
And he helped you fix it up.
And he helped me fix it, which was great because I needed some help on that. But it was a really cool trip. I actually had a ton of fun with that. We went fishing for some native cutthroat, some real sneaky small water but big fish, and went overlanding with it. Kind of, hopefully, it was just a start to hopefully some bigger, cooler trips to come with that truck and with that idea. But I think it was an awesome spot to start.
Yeah, it was a really good intro to kind of overlanding, and a way for us to experiment with what's it look like to build a vehicle for fly fishing adventures, and what's the most budget friendly way we can do it? Where do we need to spend the money? Where do we not? So it'll be fun for you guys to follow along with. I'm pretty excited to see where that series ends up going. I think both Adam, Colby, Steve, and I are excited to try and push the limits there. But the initial project will be super fun to just kind of like dip our feet in.
Oh, well, we also recorded a podcast for those of you guys who are not just the video fans, but we also recorded a podcast on that one. We don't know when this podcast you're listening to right now is actually going to air. So I don't know if that podcast of Overlanding is out or not. But if it's not, keep an eye out because that one's going to be coming out pretty soon.
Yeah, just make sure you stay in touch with us through the Ramblin' Fly and Blue Line Instagram pages. That'll keep us up to date on what all's going on since we're a complete unorganized mess on the back end.
Well, what about the other trip we did, Brent?
This one's right after my own heart. We got old Hobo Steve back out here for a second time.
Dang.
Out west, that is. And
2
we
times
went
in
on
a row.
I can't believe it. But we went on a fall streamer R&D trip. Adam had some new flies that he was testing, as long as some
that we barely got to use.
Yep.
For reasons.
Yeah, that trip definitely threw us for a loop. I mean, we went out there pretty confident in the way we were going to be able to catch these fish, and
none of that panned out.
Yeah, we had to make some adjustments. So that'll be a fun one to watch along. We did, again, record a podcast about that. So those of you that only like to listen, follow us on Ramblin' Fly on Instagram and on Blue Line, and we'll keep you updated on when and where things will be posted.
Yeah, that podcast should be towards the end of November. So,
yep,
that one should be. But yeah, that was a fun trip. We ended up catching some cool fish, some big fish, some fish in ways that we did not expect for the time of year. Yeah, that one actually worked pretty well. I actually really liked that trip. Threw us for a loop, and I think our podcast, the video, hope is going to kind of talk about that a little bit. But if you guys are, we get quite a few questions like, how do you determine what you're doing, technique and fishing, and how do you change that up while you're out there? That podcast where we deep dive into that trip is going to give you a lot of insight, I think, into how our mindset as to kind of when we're doing some different things, because man, it was a really weird fishing trip, and we had to change tactics, not even just day to day, but like hour to hour. We were having to change our tactics as to what we were doing between weather and water, and it was weird. So yeah, so if you are interested in that, make sure you listen to that podcast, because I think the back end of that podcast is going to give you a lot of insight into hopefully some tips and tricks on being able to adapt to situations while you're fishing.
Yeah, so let's get into the gear debate, as we'll call it here. But what kind of spurred this thought was I recently got to fish the Sage Igniter and throw it in some pretty heavy conditions, like upwards of 20-mile-an-hour winds. We were throwing bigger flies and sinking lines. And, I've obviously spent a lot of time with the NRX Plus swim fly. And those are like two very, very different theories on taper design on how to throw a streamer. So I figured it'd be fun to kind of break that down a little bit and talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages to each taper. So we'll start out with like, what are the two general tapers, which we have talked a little bit about, but this is kind of a pretty cut and dry example. The two theories are a swim fly style taper, which is stiff tip section, softer or more moderate mid section, and then a stiff butt section. Then on the igniter side is basically a very, very stiff taper all the way through, with, if you want to call it more moderate, would be towards the tip. And it goes increasingly stiff as you get towards the butt of the rod. The theory with the swim fly is that it's a little bit easier to cast, or easier on the angler, because it's easier to get the rod to load in the middle and the rod does more of the work. This does kind of limit your top end power, and it limits how tight you can make the loop. And then the igniter's on the far end of that, whereas it basically just wants full stop as much power as you can get. It doesn't necessarily make it easier on the caster to get the rod to work for you. I believe I haven't spent any time with the Sage payload yet, but it's along the same lines as the Swimfly as far as taper design. And then there's plenty of other brands that kind of fall in between and into these categories.
I'm probably in the minority on this one because I prefer a soft action rod. Um, I'm not really sure where that kind of happened for me, but it, just in across the board, it my rod preferences changed probably about 10 years ago. When I was newer and really trying to learn some things, I preferred a stiff fast action rod. Um, but over the past few years, I've really started to like a softer action rod a lot more. So that Swimfly really appeals to me with that, where that mid tip, and especially because I throw big flies with pretty heavy fly lines, and I'm blind casting all day. I mean, of course, I'm casting to areas, but I mean, I'm casting all the time while I'm on the front of the boat. It's not, holding the rod on the flats, watching for a fish and then making, a few casts a day. So, I really like that where you get the help from the rod with loading, where that swim fly is going to bend a little further down into the rod, which really helps you pick up that stuff easier, for 4 or 5 hours a day trying to throw bigger flies. Um, but you definitely become limited because I think your accuracy is going to, my accuracy anyways, increases with a softer rod, and I get a little more feel, especially at short range.
Mm-hmm.
But it really does limit, that rod limits you because there's not as much. You can't throw the biggest flies. Maybe you can't throw the heaviest lines, and you get limited on distance pretty quickly with those softer rods. Where that's the difference with the saltwater taper is that you're going to be able to throw any fly. You're never going to be limited to your fly selection. You're not going to be limited on what sink tip line you want to throw, whether it's the heaviest like depth charge, the heaviest type 7/8 sink tip, whatever. And you're going to be able to, cast that a lot further. So personally, when we're rigging up in the boat, if you were like to go fish with me, if I was streamer fishing, probably actually less trout, but more like if I was going bass fishing, I have a one of each in the boat. I like to have a soft 7 and a stiff 8. And I've been fishing those saltwater tapers for a long time as 8 weights in my boat. And then I run those 7 weights for more accurate casts, trying to like really throw stuff up under trees, next to logs, whatever, where I need to be more accurate. And then I swap over to that heavier rod if I'm dredging flies, the big like tickle monster, that fly, it just excels on that stiffer big rod, where you get that soft tip with that action. It's a lot more responsive for doing stuff like jigging and dredging than that swim fly is. So I like the swim fly because it does give that kind of pop and pull when you use that rod tip to help move the fly. But I love the responsiveness that you get out of those saltwater, the stiff rods. So
it's pretty situational.
it is for me, anyways. That's
Mm-hmm.
I truthfully don't use the stiff stuff a lot for trout. It's more
Right.
of for me, it's more of a warm water scenario. Unless I was throwing the tickle monster warm water stuff or for trout, which works obviously well as we found out. But
Yep. Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, the shorter shots that are kind of, you're fishing, you might be fishing a sink 6, but it's probably not actually getting down very deep. The swim fly or the kind of moderate mid taper is really useful for picking up and putting down, picking up and putting down. It certainly is less taxing on the caster. I did notice fishing the igniter all day. I hadn't fished in a while, so maybe I'm out of shape, but my hand was quite tired trying to punch that thing through the wind all day. To get into that power, you have to work a little bit harder. Whereas, the swim fly, and I'm imagining the payload kind of do more of the work for the angler. So
sure,
give and take there. I mean, most of our trout situations are 40 feet or less. And
right,
really, we're not fishing all that deep. It's a pretty, you got to have a pretty specific use case to dredge or run and or cast
Yeah.
and need to throw big flies further than about 40 feet. But there are certainly times when
For
the wind picks up and it is a longer shot that, hey, you might want the power.
Yep. Yep. For me, just I guess to kind of give folks a little bit of a wider scope, I would say there's a lot more of the stiffer saltwater tapers than there are those more specific freshwater. The swim fly is one of the top ones. I would say really a lot of stuff from Winston. And then there may be a couple of people like, obviously Sage makes kind of a more specific, softer rod for streamers, more specific. There's a couple, but most fly rods on the market these days are going to be that stiff taper. That seems to be how the market is really going. I'm not sure if you could say anything, maybe the clientele, I don't know if that's driven clientele based or where that's coming from, but to me, there's very limited sources.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's actually that the market has been using saltwater tapers for the newer emerging streamer type, heavy sinking lines, bigger flies, because that's what's been available. And now there are companies making rods for this specific purpose, like the swim fly, the payload. I believe Echo has
Yep.
a streamer taper that's similar.
Yeah, I
So
think St.
yeah,
Croix does too. Has one that's specific, like streamer rod.
yep,
But I know I'm definitely in the minority on that. But I guess let's say, because we also, if you guys were listening to the intro there, we said we would kind of talk pros and cons of each. Sure. So obviously, if you had all the money in the world and you wanted to have the best of everything, I would have one of each in the boat, like what I do if I'm fishing or guiding. What's your thought, Brent, on if you could only have one? Because most people probably are not going to be able to have multiple streamer setups.
right. Well, I think this gets into be a little bit of a tough conversation because a lot of people are trying to buy multi-purpose rods. So, in the past, when I was working in the shop, there was a lot of people that came in and wanted a saltwater 8-weight that could also throw streamers. In which case, you're going to sell
Yep.
them a saltwater taper because the streamer taper performs. It's not ideal on the flats.
Horrible in saltwater.
Yeah, I don't know if it's horrible. It's just certainly not optimal. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's how you get a lot of the saltwater tapers in trout boats for streamers. But if you're looking for a trout rod, I think generally I would pick the streamer taper that has that kind of more moderate midsection, because most of the fishing time you're going to be spending is blind casting, and you're really not up against long casts or a lot of wind, hopefully most of the time. When the wind does pick up, or if you have a unique situation where you want to throw those big lines and bigger flies, that's when I might start reaching for a more saltwater taper, such as like a NRX plus salt or igniter, or everyone makes a saltwater taper that's going to fit the need for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say if you were only going to have one, if you wade for trout and most of what you like to streamer fish are smaller creeks where you're not having, maybe a little more grown up, you're not dealing with as much wind, and even if you're throwing sink tips or big flies, I think if you're dealing with a lot of like accurate casts where you're really trying to throw up in front of a rock or next to a log or up underneath some brush, I think that, and you're certainly on foot, I think that softer, more streamer specific rod is going to do you better.
Mm-hmm.
Versus, and you don't have much saltwater application with it. Versus,
Yep.
if you fish maybe out west, big rivers, lots of wind, big flies, really heavy sink tips, and you don't want to be limited by distance on cast and things like that, then I definitely think going with that saltwater taper is a way to go if you're only going to do one streamer setup, and
Mm-hmm.
or if you also want to have a rod that you're going to take to the salt, maybe go redfish or bonefish a couple times a year, and you want to double duty that rod for trout or smallmouth or bass or whatever. Or carp is also a really big one because I know a lot of carp guys use those saltwater rods too.
Mm-hmm.
then I would do the saltwater taper. So I think that soft taper doesn't have as much, range and availability. Um,
Yeah,
it's
it's a
not the
purpose
do
built
everything.
rod.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but down south, like when we went to Alabama and did that bass trip, the moderate mid kind of that streamer taper was, oh man, it was beautiful down there.
it's primo. It's primo.
Yep, yep.
Um, but yeah. Um, well, we were going to try to keep this podcast a little short. I say we move on past the streamer into the into, I guess, let's do a dry fly rod and a nymph rod, or maybe not specific rod, but setup.
Mm-hmm.
If you're only going to have uh, try to pick down to one rod that does the most stuff, or up to, all right, well, this is the ideal situation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I
which one
think
do you want to do next?
what kind of started this thought between Adam and I, or this conversation, which we always geek out on this stuff, but um, I've been running around to shops now talking about Rio lines, and a lot of them, or a handful of them, have complained about there being too many line offerings, and it's difficult to make a decision. Well, a lot of the trout guys around Colorado end up picking a 5 weight as their multi-duty rod, and they end up putting a fly line on there that is generally better suited for nymphing, because that is what we do a lot of out here. So it makes sense to like kind of air that setup on the nymphing side because we do it a lot. But you end up having some people coming back saying, hey, well, this 5 weight kind of sucks for dry fly fishing. And a lot of that has to do with the line choice more.
Yeah, it's probably not
I
even the
would
rod.
argue. Yeah, I would argue more than the rod. So I guess let's talk about kind of the two main examples that I think of. We could probably add a third, would be the Scientific Angler's Infinity, the Rio Grande, and the Airflow Power Taper. Those would
Yeah,
be your kind of general purpose fly lines, leaning more towards nymphing. Um,
and I guess to interject with that I think personally, if you are trying to set up one rod, that's the best universal way to do it. Just like you said, because you could do you with that heavier nymph line, you almost get that floating streamer line out of that. So even though it's going to be able to handle those big nymph rigs, but you're still going to get the conehead woolly boogers, the smaller articulated stuff like our Madison sculpin or whatever could be handled great on that. But then even though it's not going to be ideal, you can still dry fly fish with that line.
mhm.
Or if you are throwing, say you do go hit the salmon fly hatch, or you do go throw those big dry drop rigs, I think that line is still great for that. So if you guys are listening and you want to have one setup, to me, that's the budget setup right there.
I would agree with that. And I think to kind of argue against that, where that setup really doesn't shine is on a more delicate setting. If you're fishing to rising fish with basically if you're fishing to rising fish, a hopper
It's
dropper, you're
it's gonna
prospecting.
it's awful for that. It's awful
Yeah,
for that,
yeah, it makes it quite
as we
hard to
found out.
throw a nice loop and set down gently because they're kind of just more powerful. They're going to be more aggressive with the turnover. So it's quite difficult to get those lines to.
Yeah, or for really small tippet as well, in my opinion, because you're not going to get the same kind of tippet protection with that setup. Versus if you did have a specific dry fly rod, in my opinion, I don't. A
Yeah,
lot of those, if the heavier, the stiffer rods are going to, you're just not going to have that really good tipper protection that a super soft mid action dry fly specific rod is going to get.
right. Yeah, you kind of run into that if your general purpose 5 weight is on the very stiff end. I
Yes,
think most of the 5 weights now are pretty manageable down to 6x. I don't think you should
I
have a
agree with
ton
that.
of issues at 6x. Um, we ran into that issue because we were fishing a 6 weight, like a fast action 6 weight, and trying to do dry fly duty with it, which was a terrible
Yeah,
error on our part to not bring more dry fly rod.
That was our fault.
Yeah.
um, and so again, I kind of got. I'm the weird one out here again. When I moved out west, well, when I started fishing out west, my go-to combo is a 6 weight, a soft 6 weight instead of a general purpose 5 weight. I like a soft 6 weight is my number one rod. I have that rod in my hand more than any other, unless I'm streamer fishing, because I really like the tipper protection that you get, but it still can handle wind. And I have a nymph taper on it, and that lets me throw the big dry flies, big hopper droppers, or any nymph rig I want. And that's my go-to. Then I have a dry fly specific 5 weight that if I am going to get into dry flies, rising fish, pods, whatever, I do want to throw delicate dries. I have a separate rod for that, instance that we didn't have on the boat when we were fishing. But in my opinion, if you're so on the flip side, if you're going to go to a little bit of, to have a tool that's exactly right for the job, that's my opinion for what you would want.
Right. So your ideal trio of rods, and I think the trio of rods is, if we're throwing budget out the window, that's the program, would be to have a
5, 6,
streamer
7.
taper 7, a soft 6 weight, and kind of would you call it a mid action 5 weight, or would you want a faster kind of?
Either or, I would say like just a good general purpose 5 weight.
Yep.
Personally, for me, again, I want some absolute floppy noodle of a rod, which is what I run as my dry fly rod. I mean, you can feel it bend in a cork.
Right.
But that's what I like for my dry fly rod, because sometimes I kind of got into this notion from out west. Big fish, small flies, and small leaders, or small, thin leaders, and it can be tough. So I like, and again, I just personally really like those soft rods. But
Yep. And I'm kind of the opposite when it comes to my dry fly rod. I want a kind of faster action. You can shrink the loop down nice and tiny and be really accurate. It's a less forgiving setup, so I end up casting into the weeds often. But I kind of like that aspect of it, is just being a little more precise when you get to do the dry fly thing.
I think a lot more people are in your boat than my boat, because there's like no company that makes a rod for me, but every company makes a rod for you. So
yeah, they tend to be going. I mean, the thing is, if you go with a fast action rod and you build the power into the rod, you can slow it down with a heavier line. So
yeah, that's true.
If you're stuck with the rod taper being the limiting factor there, then yeah, it makes more sense to make the faster action rod and slow it down with a line than it does to put a power limited rod that you can't really
right.
add power to.
And plus, there's not that many people out here who are listening that can go purchase a rod for one specific function, versus, even though it's probably a better tool for that one function, versus everyone can make one of those faster action rods, like a Swiss Army knife. It's going to do everything.
Yeah, and but to make it do those things, you kind of have to line it and pair the lines differently. So
yep, you do. You absolutely do.
Awesome.
So really, so we hit dries, nymphs, and streamers.
Mm-hmm.
I think in reality, what you said is ultimately the biggest goal is, if you were trying to ball on a budget, you have a rod that isn't maybe doing what you want it to do. Maybe you've got a rod that you like to nymph with, but you're like, man, I need to go buy a dry fly rod. But holy crap, that's another $500-600 that I've got to go spend, that I don't want to go spend. I think personally, you need to look at your line before you look at a new rod. And so kind of go maybe shifting from, a streamer rod, a nymph rod, and a dry fly rod. Brent, how would you tackle a line situation like that?
Right. So the rod does end up being the limiting factor if you have a 5-weight. You can get away with more with the 6-weight as far as pulling double duty on streamer side and maybe the dry fly side. Um, but that also depends where you're fishing. The 6 weight might be a little on the heavy side if you're fishing tailwaters across, Colorado. The 5 would be preferred there. But anyways, back to the lines. Yes, you can. Let's take just a standard 6 weight, for example, as your one do it all rod. If you put 3 different lines on that thing, then you could have an effective tool for all 3 purposes. You could put a sink tip line on there and get it to do streamer duty. That's probably going to be a little bit heavier of a line. It's going to make that rod feel nice and slow, but it's going to load into the cork and do the work for you. Then you can put a generally heavier floating line, maybe SA Infinity, Rio Grande, Airflow Power, I guess,
Yeah.
and get that to do the nymph duty really well. But if you want to tone it back and be able to do some more delicate dries, then you might want to look at something like a Rio Gold, a SA Trout. I don't know the.
Airflow, I think, is just would be universal taper, or they have a tactical taper.
Okay. Yep. So you're basically going to step the line down to be a lighter line so that it doesn't plop so hard. It is
Yep.
going to make the casting a bit less forgiving. Your timing is going to have to be a little more sharp to
Yep.
load that 6 weight rod with less weight in the fly line. But really, with a trio of lines, you can make that one rod do more purpose.
So if folks are wanting to do that, what's the best way to do it? Would you say grab the lines? Would you mess with like having a separate spool? Would you buy a reel with a couple spools?
It really comes down to budget and how much tolerance you have to messing around on Riverside. The
Yeah.
optimal setup would be to have 3 separate rods, all for their purpose. The next would be to have one rod or, 2 rods, I guess, but let's say one rod and 3 separate reels. So you don't have to mess with kind of changing leaders and whatnot. You can just cut your
Yep.
fly off, swap the reel, and go. Going down on budget, you could go to 3 different spools. So each spool for that same exact reel would have those lines. And then the cheapest way to do it would be to use the little cards that come with your fly line and kind of wind the line on and off.
Yeah.
That's probably not really realistic to do on Riverside.
But no, I think you're 100% right on that. And especially when I was working in a shop, all the time you'd have people come in and be like, "Man, I need a new rod. This rod doesn't do what I need it to do." You're like, "All right,
Mm-hmm.
what's going on?" You try to diagnose these problems, and all of a sudden, most of it comes down to line. That the line is not paired with the rod correctly, and
Mm-hmm.
all you need to do is put a new line on it. I say this quite a bit. Like, it doesn't matter if you have a Ferrari. If you put a Honda engine in it, it's going to drive like a Honda. So
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think the biggest thing, if you are having any sort of issues with your rod, you're like, man, it's not doing what I need it to do. The first thing that you should do is not look at rods. You need to look at new lines.
Yeah, at least do the dummy check to say, hey, is my line applicable to what I'm trying to use it for?
Yep.
And then, sure, there are times when maybe it is the rod that's holding you back.
Yeah, if you have a 5 or even a 6 and you're trying to streamer fish with it, you're going to be very limited to the flies that you can throw,
Mm-hmm.
as far as size wise, or how big and bulky they are, or just with how deep you can get them. I think that's rods certainly can be limiting, and having 2 rods, especially if you like to streamer fish a lot, having a specific streamer setup makes sense. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I don't know. Hopefully that was helpful for you guys as far as that goes. So you got any more tips or tricks or anything general along the lines of, like, setting up rods and reels and lines?
We kind of went over, the ideal setup, which is kind of gluttonous on the gear side, to kind of a moderate setup to a more affordable. If anyone has any tips or tricks on the affordable side of swapping lines in the middle of a day, I'd love to hear those. Aside from having extra spools for your reel, I haven't seen or really found a really good way to swap lines in the middle of a day. But
The cheapest the cheapest situation is that those cassette reels, because then your spools
Mm-hmm.
are, if you buy a cassette reel, of course you may have to go buy a new reel, but a cassette is only like $20 off a
Right.
cassette reel. If you guys are, they're not super common. I know some of the Euro guys that use them, but
Yeah.
those actually could be maybe a good option and pretty budget friendly to change in multiple lines, or keeping the the nice, if you have any of the plastic spools off your lines, not those flimsy cardboard ones that some lines are coming on now. But I like to keep some of those around, and I can, even especially even with a buddy, you can change those out pretty quick if you kind of have an
Mm-hmm.
idea of what your application is going to be. Like, all right, well, I'm probably going nymph and streamer today, so we're doing this. Or if I'm going streamer specific, we'll do a sink tip. Or if I'm going to do probably dries and nymphs and some smaller stuff, then maybe we go with this line.
Yep.
Certainly, certainly there are some other budget options out there for that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not crazy to say like, okay, I'm going out fishing this weekend. I'm pretty certain that I'm going to get into nymphing and dry flies. So you could then swap your reel and like only bring the maybe the one nymph line and know that you're going to suffer a little on dry flies, but at least you're not having to deal with the
Yeah,
streamer line at all. So it does make
yeah,
sense to
that's true.
have some spare lines, and the seasonality changes to where sometimes there's middle of winter, there's probably not going to be fish rising, so you don't need to worry about the dry fly line. uh, but yeah, I think that's a little bit
Unless
overlooked.
you go
People
with
generally,
us, and then
yeah, then we end up
yeah,
with weird rising fish when they shouldn't be, which was awesome. Yeah.
it was
So
unexpected for sure.
yeah, I'd like to hear if anyone has a creative way to change lines without a separate reel. I know I've used a drill before to swap lines around in the car, but probably not going to
Yep,
carry that to the
that's a good
river.
one.
Hmm. So
Well, there we go. Yeah, comment below if you have any questions on that. Brent and I'll get back to you, or shoot us a DM at our Instagram page at Ramblin Fly.
mhm.
And I hope you guys like the podcast. Again, remember, if you are listening, you can check out the video version on the Ramblin Fly YouTube channel. Or if you are watching, you can also listen to these on your phone on the go, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. So you Google, Apple, I don't
Spotify,
know.
you
There's
name
about
it.
Spotify. There's quite a few.
Yep. I would like
We're
to
we're
see
we're
if
kind of
it,
cool.
we're pretty cool. We're everywhere. I would like to see people comment their favorite rod/line pairings. If you've got your favorite rod setup that you think you have a line you love, I'd love to hear what that pairing is in the comments.
Yep. Yeah, that'd be a good one. Yeah, if you guys want to comment below what you're using, what your favorite from the year has been, yeah, comment that below. That'd be a cool one to hear, and maybe give some other folks some help if they're looking, if they've got a rod and need a different line. That's a good one to do.
Mhm.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys.
Well, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys in the next episode.
See ya.